Stephen A. Smith will join me on age limits for lawmakers, national competency tests, and who he says that the Democrats should think about as an alternative to President Biden. ESPN's Stephen A. Smith is the host of First Take and the host of the Stephen A. Smith Show on YouTube, and he joins me now. Stephen, good to see you.
Hey.
Thanks for coming on.
Good to see you.
I was listening to your latest podcast, and you talk about this. In addition to talking about this, but you also had on a young, up-and-coming, figure in the political world, David Hogg. But
Yes.
If you were to look at the state of Washington, the candidates that we have, do you think that there should be a requirement for people to step down? And at what age should that be?
I don't think age should have anything to do with it, but I do believe that when you're looking at somebody whose health is clearly debilitating, at least to some degree, we're living in a society right now, Abby, where those folks are being insulted. We're supposed to be revering and honoring the elderly, but that's when they're willing to step away if they know that they're not, dare I say, as sharp as they used to be. And what we're finding right now is that people are pushing them front and center because we have younger representatives who can't seem to gain any traction, can't seem to ingratiate themselves with an audience to the point where they're tagged as the future and they're tagged as individuals who should be put to the forefront. And what I was speaking of when I spoke about my podcast, I said, listen, some would argue that President Joe Biden is doing an outstanding job on the left. Obviously, folks on the right would feel otherwise. I only brought up Mitch McConnell when he froze, not once, but twice, to point out, okay, well, if you're on the right, you were quick to bring up every little thing about President Biden. But you're going to ignore what you're seeing here. You can't ignore it. And in the case of the left, where you're looking at Joe Biden, I'm saying to myself, okay, listen, this guy he's been around for a very, very long time. He was a senator for decades. We get all of that. We know who Joe Biden is. The flip side to it is that by knowing who he is, we also know that he's not what he used to be. And if you call yourself a progressive, a liberal, and you are relying on an 82-year-old, which is how old he will be at the time that it's time for him to run for re-election, what does it say about your party that you're depending on him in order to win an election? That to me is problematic, and I thought it needed to be said.
Well, it's on both sides, both the voters
Yes.
who are voting older people into
Yes.
office and the party that's keeping them in those positions. One of the things, we played a Nikki Haley Biden. She's been going after President Biden on the age thing, but she's also proposed this mental competency test for politicians over the age of 75. Do you agree with that idea?
Yes, I really do. And the reason why, because there's nothing wrong. If you're just saying there is a standard that needs to be met and it's applicable to all on either side of the aisle, I'm all for it. Because we certainly want people that are cogent enough and alert enough and in position to handle their business. You're talking about a job that requires you to run the country, the commander in chief, for crying out loud. And it's not just about when it comes to law enforcement. You're talking about tax reform. You're talking about education. You're talking about immigration.
But
you're talking about a plethora of issues.
Shouldn't there be a mental competency test for all of them? Shouldn't there be a mental competency test for all of them?
I'm saying it's a standard. I'm only speaking to the standard. I'm saying no one should be ostracized and no one should be immune from having to be subjected to the same standards. If there is a job, any job that you point to out there, it's a requirement that comes with it. You can't just walk on the air and be Abby Phillips. Excuse me. This is a young lady that's been doing great work at CNN, and before that, the Washington Post, the Politico, and the list goes on. Stephen A. Smith, New York Daily News, Philadelphia Inquirer, Fox Sports, ESPN. You can't just walk through the door and do those jobs. There's a requirement that you have to meet in order to do certain things, regardless of the profession. Why should the presidency of the United States or any elected office be any different? I have no problem with that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of tests and requirements, and since we have you here, I might as well ask you, because Vivek Ramaswamy, who's also running in this Republican field, he's proposing a constitutional amendment that would require that young people who are 18 to 24 years old, have to pass a civics test or serve 6 months in the military in order to even vote. Is that fair?
No. Excuse my language. Hell no. That is not, this is America. And the reality of the situation is last time I checked, there isn't a draft taking place to compel you to serve your country. It would be nice if everybody wanted to do it. But in America, you have the freedom to do otherwise. And as far as I'm concerned, to have some kind of constitutional amendment that requires you to serve in that capacity, a capacity that he deems fitting, I think is a bit self-serving at this particular moment in time, because he's an individual that's obviously running for the presidency of the United States, and that's going to ingratiate him with some of the folks on the right. I get that. As a matter of fact, I'm scheduled to interview him in a matter of days. I'm glad you brought that up, because
that'll
I'm going
be very
to ask
interesting.
him about that. Because I certainly don't agree with that. But I understand why he's doing it, because there are folks, voters on the right, that's going to, that's going to sway them to some degree. And right now, I think we're living in an age where we see politicians, particularly when you're on the campaign trail, you're willing to say whatever you believe will curry votes. And I think this is one of those examples. I'm not saying he does or does not mean it. I don't know him. I've never met him. I've never talked to him. But the bottom line is, I find it very, very difficult to believe that you would just come out your mouth and say something like that as a potential elected official in the year 2023, unless you believed it was going to work favorably for you in getting votes.
And Stephen A., stand by. You have an alternative candidate for Democrats other than Joe Biden, so we'll talk about that. Plus, and we're back now with Stephen A. Smith talking about age in politics, a conversation becoming all too common on both the right and the left. If President Biden were to win re-election, that would make him 82 when he starts his second term. Now, some people are floating alternative candidates to run on the Democratic ticket. I want to bring Stephen A. back. Going back to this Biden issue, you on your show actually mentioned the California governor, Gavin Newsom, as an alternative to President Biden for Democrats. Why?
Well, listen, in all honesty, I've never really been that big of a fan of Gavin Newsom. He knows this. I've spoken to him before. But I will tell you, he's very smart. He's very sharp. I get that. I'm just allergic to all of those high taxes that I see in California, for crying out loud. I think the state of California invents ways to take your money. And sometimes that's a turnoff for me, to be quite honest with you. As a registered independent who heavily leans towards voting Democrat come election time, I still find that to be a tad bit odd. But here's the thing. I'm looking at former President Donald Trump and his base, and I'm seeing folks on the right who are elected officials, regardless of what they want to say, they're capitulating to him because they're fearful of alienating voters. And you just know that even though he lost the last election, yes, America, he did lose the daggone election. Okay, no matter what he says, the reality is that he did receive over 73 or 74 million votes. And so when I look at it from that perspective, I'm saying, okay, if there's any kind of wiggle room when it comes to Biden and deciding to go against that grain, who knows if this man ends up avoiding all of these charges against him and not doing any jail time, what he's going to be able to pull off. I'm looking for a Democratic candidate that can articulate himself forcefully and fiercely against the right in an articulate fashion that can gather a level of support that it's going to take to ensure that the Democrat remains in the White House for the next 4 years come 2024. I know that Biden would get my vote over Donald Trump. You can bet the house on that. But I do find myself concerned at times looking at the climate that we're living in, seeing him gain traction, not lose it with DeSantis, with Ramaswamy, with Christie, with Nikki Haley, and everybody else, Asa Hutchinson. You want to throw him out there? Fine. The list goes on and on. I'm watching him, Tim Scott, let me not forget him. I'm watching him continue to separate himself from that pack. And I'm getting concerned that if you find anything that could be problematic for Biden, as in Hunter Biden or anything else, who knows what could tip the scales. That concerns me. And so you want somebody forceful and articulate and sharp enough to fight that fight. And I think that Gavin Newsom has come across as somebody capable of doing that.
That's really interesting. I mean, we've been talking a lot about that on this show because I think among Democrats, you're an independent, but you vote perhaps largely Democratic. There's a big
95+% of the time Democrat, yes.
There's a big debate about what to do here. And the idea that it's just Biden and everybody's just happy is probably not the reality of the situation within that party. But Stephen, before you go, I wanted to ask you about this. One of your competitors, Skip Bayless, as many people may know, launched a revamped show this week. And your show, The First Take, crushed him in the ratings. So there were a lot of headlines about how all the co-hosts were shouting over him and dominating the airwaves on Bayless's show. What were your thoughts about that and how it went?
Well, listen, I wouldn't be where I am today if it were not for Skip Bayless giving me the opportunity to bring me on the show First Take in 2012. He's a friend and a brother, and I'm eternally grateful to him for the opportunity that he gave me. But he's on the other side now. Michael Irvin is a friend of mine. Keyshawn Johnson is a friend of mine. Richard Sherman is friends of mine. Michael Irvin and myself and Keyshawn Johnson and myself are very, very close. We're like brothers to one another. But they know what time it is. They're on the other side. And so as a result of that, primarily Skip Bayless and Undisputed, they do what they do at FS1. I do what I do at First Take. I arrived in 2012. We've been #1 since. He departed in 2016. We've been #1. He was going from 2016 to 2023. First Take still remains #1. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as I'm on this show, we're going to stay #1 because I don't play to lose. And so knock on wood, who knows what's going to happen. God has blessed me and Molly Kiram and all the producers and all the honchos at ESPN to be #1. But Abby Phillips, I don't play to lose. I'm here to win. And I'm not rooting against Skip Bayless or all of my brothers, but I am rooting for myself. I don't want them to fail. I just want them to be perpetually in second place to First Take. And I aim for it to be exactly that in anything that I do. It's just that simple to me.
And that's that on that. I hear you.
All right.
You can catch Stephen on ESPN and YouTube. Stephen A. Smith, thank you so much for joining us tonight.